Hey, welcome back, everyone. We're here for part two of our Anatomy of the Heart series. And today we're going to learn all about the blood vessels and valves of the heart. And you may have noticed that I have an image of a plumber here. This little guy, his name is Mario. Sometimes he becomes Super Mario. But anyway, Mario is a pretty famous plumber, as you may or may not be aware. And basically, today we're going to learn all about the plumbing of the heart. So, we're going to learn about how the blood flows through the heart, the pipes it goes through, the valves connected to those pipes, how they're connected, which direction it flows, all that good stuff. So, we're going to learn all about the major vessels. We're going to learn about the valves. We're going to learn about blood flow direction and the clinical importance of the blood supply, aka, why is it important that the blood supplies blood to itself? So, the heart has to give itself its own blood supply. All right. Well, with no further ado, let's get started. All right. So, the first thing we're going to talk about are the major vessels of the heart. When we look at the vessels that are connected to the heart, there's basically two major classes, the veins and arteries. And we talked about this previously in the blood vessels chapter, but just to refresh your memory, the difference between veins and arteries is mainly that veins carry blood to the heart and arteries pump away. So always remember arteries away is an easy way to remember that. Now, most of the time, almost every single time in your body, veins carry deoxygenated blood. And there's a couple exceptions that we're going to talk about in a minute. So usually you can think that veins are carrying the deoxygenated blood, but that's not always the case. And we'll see that in a second. So when we look at veins, the most important vein, like the largest vein in your entire body, is called the vena cava. And so it's broken down into two parts, a superior and inferior vena cava. And both of these carry deoxygenated blood to the heart. The difference being that the superior is carrying blood from above the heart, like the top part of your body, and the inferior vena cava is carrying blood from below your heart. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. So here is our heart, and you can see up here at the top, here is our superior vena cava. It's this little blood vessel coming down and dropping blood into the heart itself. Below that, we have the inferior vena cava that's bringing the blood up from down below. And when we look at a farther, looking out farther from the heart, seeing the whole body, we have blood that's going up to your head and then coming back from the superior vena cava. Actually, blood coming from your arms, because most of that comes in through your shoulders, is also going to come in from the superior vena cava. Everything from your abdomen on down into your legs is going to come up from the inferior vena cava, and these both meet together at the right atrium. So the vena cava is the largest vein in your body. You could literally stick your thumb inside of it. That's how big it is. It's a very large blood vessel. I know that was a really gross way to describe it, but it's true. The vena cava is huge. It's the largest vein in the body. Like I said, between the superior and inferior vena cava, almost all the blood in your body returns to the heart. Great. The third vein we have to talk about, besides the superior and inferior vena cava, is called the coronary sinus. Anytime we see a blood vessel with the word coronary, like you may have heard of somebody suffering from a coronary something or other, coronary refers to something that is part of the heart itself. So the coronary sinus is a blood vessel on the heart. And sinus is a word that we use for veins a lot. And the reason why it's called the coronary sinus, it's a big hollow space that collects all the deoxygenated blood from the heart wall. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the heart has to have its own blood supply pumped to it from itself, which is kind of weird. But the heart pumps blood to your body, including the heart. And this is where all that blood that went to the heart muscles is collected and returned back to the heart. So this brings in way less blood. This is a much smaller vessel than the vena cava. So let's say like the vena cava carries like 95, 98% of the blood in your body back to the heart. The coronary sinus sends in that other, 3 to 5% that goes to the heart itself. And then finally, the pulmonary veins, and these are the really weird ones. Pulmonary is the anatomical term for lungs. So anytime we see something with pulmonary attached onto it, we're thinking about our lungs. So the pulmonary vein is kind of the weirdo here, because even though it's a vein, it's carrying oxygenated blood. And the reason why it's a vein is it's returning to the heart, but it's bringing the oxygenated blood that just came back from the lungs. So in fact, this is probably like the highest concentration of oxygen in your entire body, because it literally just got oxygen from the lungs and it's going back to the heart so it can get pumped out to the rest of the body. And we'll go through this a little bit later and it'll make more sense. All right, so once again, arteries are going to carry blood away from the body, and usually this is oxygenated blood, except for the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk, also known as the pulmonary arteries, carry deoxygenated blood going to the lungs. So notice that our pulmonary veins and our pulmonary trunk are kind of like a pair. The pulmonary trunk sends deoxygenated blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. It goes to the lungs, and then the blood comes back through the pulmonary veins after it's just gotten oxygen to get pumped to the rest of your body. So these two are kind of like your reversed ones that have a little bit different blood from the rest of the body. Uh, the aorta is the largest blood vessel in your body. It's also the strongest, thickest, and heaviest blood vessel in your body. It's kind of like the fire hose of blood in your body, and it carries oxygenated blood from the heart to every single part. So, like all the way out to the tips of your fingers, the top of your head, the tips of your toes, it shoots the blood throughout the entire body. So, that's why it has to be such a thick, large blood vessel. The coronary arteries, on the other hand, are some of the tiniest vessels in your body. But once again, remember we were talking about the coronary sinus. Coronary means it's going to the heart itself. The coronary arteries carry oxygenated blood to the heart wall. So that's how the heart feeds itself. And these are the blood vessels that actually become blocked during heart attacks. And so they're super, super, super important. In fact, that's why, when we say like, oh, someone suffered a coronary, usually you're talking about them having a heart attack. So looking at the heart again, we can see here's our vena cava, superior and inferior vena cava meeting at the right atrium. We don't see any of the coronary vessels here, so they're too small to be shown in this view. But we can see up here, here's our aorta, which is the largest blood vessel, and it comes up out of the heart and actually folds down and goes down behind the heart, carrying blood to the entire body. Here are our pulmonary veins, which is kind of weird. I almost thought I got that wrong, but they're veins, even though they're in red, because they're carrying oxygenated blood back from the lungs. Over here, we have the pulmonary trunk, which is an artery, but it's deoxygenated blood going to the lungs. So you can see where things get a little bit messy here. And this is just another view showing you the exact same thing. So we can see here's our superior and inferior vena cava. Here's our aorta. This is actually called the aortic arch that comes out. And right off of the aortic arch, we see there's like this thing called the brachiocephalic trunk that sends blood up into your arm. Actually, it sends it up into your right arm, into your right carotid artery going up to the head. We have the left common carotid artery that goes up to the left side of your head. And then we have the left subclavian artery, which feeds your left arm. So we actually have three branches, two that go to the head, one that goes to your right arm, one that goes to your left arm. And then the aortic arch folds down and sends blood out to the rest of the lower body. All right. And this is just the back view. So if you want to see the inferior view of everything, you can see here's our inferior vena cava coming in the back. Here's our pulmonary veins, once again in red because they're carrying oxygenated blood. And here's our pulmonary trunk that breaks off into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Oh, also, almost forgot to mention, you can see here's our coronary sinus. That's our large vein on the heart itself, which is connected to all these other little tiny veins on the back of the heart. And if we go back to this view, you can actually see here's the coronary arteries going across the surface of the heart. All right, so that brings us to the valves. And the valves basically ensure that blood is going to be able to only flow in one direction throughout the heart. So these are basically what they call check valves, in that they check to make sure that the blood is flowing in the correct direction. So there's actually two different types of valves that are found inside of the heart. The first group are called the atrioventricular valves, or we call them AV valves for short, because atrioventricular is a really big word to try to say over and over again. And when we look at the atrioventricular valves, they look just like these diagrams up here. It actually kind of looks like a parachute when it's closed, but when it's open, it allows blood to go through. So you can see blood going from top to bottom can go right through. And when blood tries to go from bottom to top, it hits this little parachute-like dome and flips around and goes back the way it came. So the atrioventricular valves, there's two different valves. One is called the tricuspid valve, and it gets its name because it is made of three cusps, and that's what these little flaps are. So each one of these little flaps of tissue is a cusp. So you can see this one has two, not three. So this is actually showing you the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve. We use the two interchangeably. it's usually good to know both, but I like to use bicuspid just because I think it's more descriptive. But the bicuspid valve has two cusps. And what we find out is that the tricuspid valve is located on the right side of the heart. It's between your right atrium and right ventricle. Conveniently, check it out. Tri has an R right in the middle of it. So the tricuspid valve is found on the right side. The bicuspid valve is found on the left side between the left atrium and the left ventricle. So let's take a look. Here's another picture of these two. So you can see here's our tricuspid valve with its three closed cusps, and here's our bicuspid valve with its two closed cusps. And these are pretty large valves. They're the largest valves in your heart. This is another view of these inside of a cow's heart, which is pretty gross. But if you look very carefully, we can see here's a valve right here between the atria, which is up top, and the ventricle down below. This is the left side of the heart. So this is actually, do you know which valve it is? Turns out this is the bicuspid or mitral valve because it's on the left side. This little tiny guy over here is the tricuspid on the right side. And the tricuspid's usually a lot smaller because the right side's not as strong as the left. Here's another view of those two valves, and you can see what they look like when they're open. And in side view, you can see when they're open, those little valves kind of hang down. And when they close, you can see it kind of forms like this little tiny dome. All right, so let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Okay, so the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, like we said, they have these valves, and they're connected to these little things called chordae tendineae, which are these little tiny tendon-like cords, which is where they get their name from. And so these are kind of like the strings on the parachute. So you guys, if you've ever seen a parachute, it's got the big dome part up on top, and then you got all the strings going down, and then they have to be connected to the person that is being, supported by the parachute. These little things that connect this to the heart are called the papillary muscles. And if you've been paying close attention, you know that papillary means nipple like. And so, literally, someone looked at these little muscles and said, hey, that looks like a nipple. So, there you go. We got papillary muscles. Basically, the papillary muscles pull down on these chordae tendineae and help to make this dome resist the flow of blood, is basically what we're doing. In fact, if you've ever used a parachute before, I don't know, maybe you went skydiving, maybe you played parachute when you were in elementary school in like gym class or something like that. You got to flip the parachute. Parachutes make a lot of noise when they fill up with air. They're going to go like, and in fact, that noise that we hear when the parachute fills with air is very similar to the sound of the heart, that lubbed up, lubbed up, lubbed up. And in fact, that's actually what you're hearing. When you're listening to heart sounds, you're actually listening to the valves closing and the blood smacking up against the valves and making that loud noise. So next time you hear someone's heartbeat, just remember that's the sound of blood smacking up against some cusps. All right, so the other type of valve that we find in the heart are called the semilunar valves because they kind of look like a moon. And so this is the semilunar valves here. There's the aortic valve right here and the pulmonary valve down here. And if you look at them, they kind of look like the tricuspid valve because they have three little tiny cusps. But it was thought that each cusp kind of looked like a little crescent moon, so that's where they get the name semilunar. So the pulmonary valve we find between the right ventricle and the lungs. And once again, anytime we see the word pulmonary, it always means related to the lungs. So there you go. The aortic valve, as you can imagine, is right by the aorta, and it connects the left ventricle to the aorta. So if you look at both of these semilunar valves, they prevent blood from going backwards out of the blood vessels. So if you go to the aortic valve, it's at the very end of the aorta where it touches the heart, and it prevents blood from going backwards from the aorta back into the heart. So every heartbeat, this thing snaps shut after the blood is pumped out of the heart and keeps the blood flowing outward. Same thing with the pulmonary valve. It prevents blood from coming backwards from the lungs and going back into the heart. And as you can imagine, this is pretty important because you don't want your heart constantly filling up with blood that it's already pumped. So these are really important little guys. When the ventricles contract, the strength of the ventricular contraction causes these valves to open up and allow blood to go through. And if blood tries to come backwards, each of these cusps is actually shaped like a little cup. It has like a little concavity to it, and it snaps shut under that pressure. So, easy way to remember the order of these valves in which the blood flows through them is that it goes tricuspid, pulmonary, bicuspid, aortic. And so, an easy way to remember that is you say, try before you buy. So it goes through the tricuspid valve before it goes through the bicuspid valve. Or I always like to remember try pulmonary, buy aortic. Great. And so this is really fun. If you look, we can see what it looks like when your tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open. Notice when these are open, that the semilunar valves are shut. Reason for this is that the AV valves are open to allow blood to come from the atria into the ventricles. Remember, they're called AV valves because they're between the atria and the ventricles. So as blood goes from the atria into the ventricles to fill them up, these valves are closed, these semilunar valves, so that blood doesn't come backwards from the aorta. So basically, we want blood to go this direction into the ventricles, not come in from this direction from the aorta. But then, in the next phase of your heartbeat, the mitral valve will close. And now we don't want blood going back into the atrium when the ventricles contract. We want blood to go into the aorta and out to the rest of the body. So we open up our semilunar valve, our aortic valve, to allow this blood out. And then when it's done going out, we snap it shut. So literally, your heart is like this: thump, 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 thump. I know it's weird, isn't it? But that's exactly what's going on inside your heart. You're basically, every time you hear that heartbeat, your heart's saying, hey, I'm going to allow blood to go into my ventricles. Nope. Now I'm kicking the blood out into the arteries. And now I'm filling up my ventricles, and now I'm filling my arteries. Ventricles, arteries, ventricles, arteries. You get the point. So that's why the valves are really important, is that they help us to control the flow of blood so it goes in the right direction. And we can see where these are all located. So here's once again, tri before you buy. So we have tricuspid on the right side. Tri has an R in it. Bicuspid on the left side. We have our pulmonary valve leading out to the pulmonary trunk, our aortic valve leading out to the aorta. And you can see blood would come in to the right atrium, go through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then get pumped through the pulmonary valve out to the lungs. After the blood goes to the lungs, it comes back through the pulmonary veins, goes into the left atrium, goes through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle, and then from there it's going to get pumped through the aortic valve into the aorta and go out to the entire body. And eventually, as it goes through your body, it'll come back in through the vena cava and come back over here to your right atrium, where it starts all over again. So tri, pulmonary, bi, aortic. Now, interesting little things that go along with that. What if you have a leaky valve? Valve disease is a really big deal, and we have to do a lot of valve replacements. So sometimes people have a valve that, for whatever reason, doesn't close all the way or doesn't operate like it's supposed to. And when people have one of these, they usually have to replace it. So there's a lot of different options. One of the things that we've come up with are these things called artificial valves. Here's some examples of some different ones. You can see how they have different designs. Some have like little leaves that pop up. This one's interesting. We have like the ball and the cage one. So basically, when blood pumps from the bottom, it comes up and lifts this little ball. The ball goes to the top of the cage, and the blood goes around it. And when blood tries to come backwards, it pushes the ball down and it seals the gap. Same thing with this Medtronic valve, single leaflet. When blood tries to come up, it lifts up this little flap. Blood can come out. When blood tries to come backwards, it pushes down on the flap and seals it. Or the St. Jude valve, same thing, which is two little flaps. We can also get porcine transplants, pig valves, where they basically take these valves, and because these valves are mostly made of collagen fibers, they basically remove all the fibroblast cells and just send the collagen fibers into the human heart, which the body eventually starts to grow new fibroblasts into, and it basically just becomes part of the heart. So they can do that for a tissue valve, or you can use human valves too. So, hey, it depends on your surgeon, depends on your age, and a lot of other factors how they do this, but there's a lot of options. Okay, so that brings us to the overall blood flow of the heart. And so, like I said, we're going to be like plumbers here. We have to be able to trace blood all the way through the heart in one whole big circle. By the way, this is one of those things where a lot of colleges require their students to learn this in intro bio classes. So if you plan to take an introductory bio class, you're probably going to have to do this at some point. So anyway, blood always flows in the heart from high pressure to low. So basically, different parts of your heart increase their pressure as the heart is contracting, and it pushes the blood from whichever chamber has the highest pressure into the next chamber in which the pressure is lower, and then that next chamber will then increase its pressure to push on to the next region. So we're always going from high to low. Basically, if you follow blood flow, we're going to start in the right atrium. So if you start in the right atrium, this is the main receiving chamber of blood from the veins. The right atrium pumps to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, we're going to pump into the pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk is going to send that blood to our lungs, and then it's going to come back from the lungs to the pulmonary veins and re enter the heart at the left atrium. The left atrium is then going to pump blood into the left ventricle. Left ventricle then pumps to the aorta, which then pumps to all the tissues of your body. This is called systemic circulation, if you'll remember. The tissues from there, the blood gets pumped back through the veins into the vena cava, and the vena cava is going to return blood to the right atrium where we start all over again. So the question is, where do our valves fit into all this? Because I didn't include them. So if you remember, we had tri-pulmonary, bi-aortic. So the tricuspid valve, of course, is between, it's an AV valve. It's between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So this is our tricuspid valve right here. We're then going to have our pulmonary valve right here between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. And then the blood is allowed to go freely from the trunk to the lungs to the pulmonary veins and back to the left atrium. Once it gets to the left atrium, our other AV valve is the bicuspid or mitral valve, which is going to be right here, allowing blood only to go from the atrium to the ventricle. Then we have our aortic valve between the left ventricle and the aorta, which is going to prevent blood from going backwards into the heart. Once blood goes to the aorta, it's able to freely pass on through your tissues and back to the vena cava, where it returns back to the right atrium and we start all over again. So this is a little map. I love this, showing this whole process. But you can see how blood enters into the heart, goes through the right atrium, right ventricle, out through the pulmonary trunk to the lungs, comes back in through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium into the left ventricle, and then pumped back out to the aorta where it goes to the whole body. And we can see it makes one big ring all the way around. One of the things that's really cool about the heart is described as a double pump because every single heartbeat, it does two different things. It's pumping both blood to your lungs and pumping blood to your body. So when your heart beats, you're both pulling blood into both the atria, the left and the right. They're both going to pump into the ventricles. The ventricles are then going to pump at the same time into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, so that every heartbeat, you're both filling your lungs with deoxygenated blood that needs to pick up oxygen, and you're pumping blood to the rest of your body to pick up or to deliver oxygen and nutrients. So it's a really effective and efficient system. That's why we have a four-chambered heart, and we have this nice wall or septum in between to divide the deoxygenated blood from the oxygenated. So really, you have kind of like two pumps in one. Pretty cool. All right, so the last little thing to talk about is our coronary circulation. Basically, how does our body give blood to itself? And or how does our heart give blood to itself? And so when we look at the coronary arteries, we find out that there are two main arteries, a left and right coronary artery. And this is what they look like. So as soon as that blood comes out through the aortic valve into the aorta, there's two immediate branches. So we have a left coronary artery, which comes on the left side and goes to the left side of the heart. And we have a right coronary artery that goes to the right side of the heart. And then each of those has many sub-branches that comes off from that. So the coronary arteries, their job is to carry oxygenated blood to the heart tissue itself. Now you're probably saying, now wait a second, doctor, that doesn't make any sense. Why does the heart have to give itself blood? And the answer is it works like this. The heart is under a ton of pressure when it's contracting. So I don't know if you realize this, but there's like giant water mains underground that carry water throughout the city. And those water mains are under incredibly high pressure. If you try to like cut a hole in a water main and have a sip, it would like blow your head off. I mean, the pressures are incredible. They are like absolutely, in some places, fatal. So you can't do that. You can't like drink from the fire hose. It would not be good. It wouldn't work out. Don't try it. But what happens is when the blood comes out through the aorta, these blood vessels are so little that only a little bit of that blood comes in, and the pressure drops down very quickly as it goes into these smaller vessels to deliver blood to the heart itself. So ironically, even though your heart is full of blood, it still needs to use these little tiny vessels to feed itself. If these blood vessels become blocked, that is what a heart attack is. And so if you were to block this left coronary vessel right up here, everything downstream from it would not get blood and would die. And so that's what's crazy, is that even though our heart's filled with blood, we are depending on these coronary arteries to feed them all the time. So the coronary arteries carry the oxygenated blood to the heart's tissue itself. If there's a blockage, that's a heart attack. But we have these little things called anastomoses. which help to prevent blockages. So an anastomosis is like a little, basically, it's a redundancy. So if you look down here, some of these blood vessels kind of overlap, so that, like, let's say we were to have a blockage down here and blood couldn't flow through these last little bits. Blood could come through the other side and go through backwards and come back up into these areas. If you remember when we talked about the circle of Willis in the brain, that's where we had like a redundant circuit in a circle, and that's basically what we see inside of the heart too. So it sometimes works to help us prevent blockages. The coronary sinus, on the other hand, is the vein, and it's going to collect all the deoxygenated blood on the backside of the heart. So if you look here very carefully, parallel to these coronary arteries, we have these coronary veins. These all wrap around and meet up here at the coronary sinus, dumping all of their deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium, where it meets up right next to the vena cava and returns the blood back to the heart so it can get pumped to the lungs. So we have a nice little system there to keep our heart going. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? That's the end. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next video.